When people study the Second World War, logistics is usually discussed in terms of fuel, ammunition, and transport routes. Food is mentioned, but often only in the broadest sense: calories per day, ration totals, or supply shortages. But in the winter campaigns of the war, particularly on the Eastern Front, food faced a very different enemy temperature. At -30 degrees Celsius, food does not merely spoil or run out, it becomes physically unusable. Bread turns to stone, meat becomes impossible to cut, canned goods freeze solid, even boiling water can become difficult to produce when fuel supplies are strained. Under those conditions, armies did not simply need food. They needed food that could survive freezing, be eaten when frozen, or be thawed with minimal effort. Across Soviet, German, Finnish, and Allied winter operations, soldiers developed a strange and largely forgotten category of wartime sustenance: frozen field foods that were never meant to be frozen, but became essential survival tools because they could endure it. These foods were rarely glamorous. Some were improvised, others were designed with cold climates in mind, but together they reveal something important about survival in extreme warfare. Calories alone were never enough. What mattered was food that could actually be eaten when the world itself had frozen. Frozen black bread often became the most dependable winter ration on the Eastern Front. Bread was the foundation of European military rations during the war, but in winter campaigns, bread behaved in ways planners had not anticipated. In temperatures below -20 degrees, traditional loaves froze into something closer to wood than food. German soldiers frequently wrote in letters that they could not bite into their bread and instead had to strike it against metal equipment or rifle butts to break it into pieces. Yet despite this problem, dense black bread, especially rye bread, proved more resilient than lighter wheat varieties. It retained some moisture when frozen and could be thawed slowly near body heat. Soviet troops learned to carry bread inside their coats, allowing it to soften slightly before eating. German soldiers sometimes kept bread inside ammunition pouches close to their bodies for the same reason. This adaptation seems simple, but it reveals a logistical lesson. The best ration in extreme cold is not the one that tastes best, but the one that remains physically edible. Rye bread's density and moisture allowed it to survive freezing conditions better than many other staples, which is why it remained a primary ration throughout winter campaigns despite its inconvenient texture. Frozen horse meat became an unexpected survival resource when supply chains collapsed. On the Eastern Front, mechanized warfare depended heavily on horses. Millions were used for artillery transport, supply wagons, and field mobility. When these animals died from exhaustion, shell fire, or starvation, their bodies often froze almost immediately in winter conditions. Under ordinary circumstances, battlefield carcasses would spoil quickly and become unusable, but at -30 degrees, the environment effectively became a natural freezer. Both German and Soviet soldiers routinely butchered frozen horses to supplement their rations. Frozen meat could be chopped with axes or bayonets and then boiled in field kitchens. In many winter encirclements, including the fighting around Rzhev and later Stalingrad, horse meat became one of the few reliable protein sources. While rarely mentioned in official reports, diaries and memoirs repeatedly describe soldiers surviving for weeks on frozen horse meat and bread. The experience reinforced a practical survival lesson later incorporated into military cold weather doctrine. In extreme climates, freezing can preserve food resources that would otherwise be lost. Frozen cabbage and fermented vegetables quietly prevented nutritional collapse. One of the lesser-known challenges of winter warfare was vitamin deficiency. Fresh produce rarely survived long supply journeys, and freezing destroyed many vegetables completely. But fermented vegetables, especially cabbage, proved remarkably resilient. Sauerkraut and other fermented cabbage products remained edible even after freezing solid. When thawed and heated in soups, they retained enough vitamin C to help prevent scurvy among troops who otherwise lived on bread and meat. German winter rations frequently included canned or barrel-packed sauerkraut for precisely this reason. Soviet field kitchens used fermented cabbage in stews and soups throughout winter campaigns. Although rarely celebrated in popular histories, these foods helped prevent serious nutritional disorders during prolonged operations. Without them, armies fighting in deep winter could have faced widespread illness unrelated to combat. So, frozen fish actually became a really practical field ration in northern theaters of the war. In regions like Finland, northern Russia, and, parts of the Baltic front, fish played an unexpectedly important logistical role. When lakes and rivers froze over, fish caught through ice holes could be stored outdoors pretty much indefinitely. The cold just preserved them perfectly. Finnish soldiers who were quite experienced in Arctic survival regularly distributed frozen fish to frontline units. The fish could be shaved into thin pieces while still frozen and then added directly to boiling water. Soviet troops stationed near major rivers used similar techniques whenever their supply lines failed. Because fish froze quickly and thawed easily when heated, it became one of the few fresh foods available in those extremely cold environments. This sort of local adaptation actually demonstrated a key survival principle that modern cold weather forces still follow. In extreme climates, local food sources can sometimes outperform centralized supply systems. Frozen fat and lard were really prized because they delivered the dense calories that cold weather demanded. You see, cold weather dramatically increases the body's energy needs. Soldiers operating in -30-degree conditions often required something like 4,000 to 6,000 calories a day just to maintain body temperature and physical performance. Fat became absolutely essential for meeting those needs. Lard, bacon fat, and animal grease were widely issued when available, since they froze without spoiling and could be added easily to soups, bread, or boiled grains. German rations frequently included pork fat blocks, while Soviet soldiers often received small portions of salted pork fat, known as salo. Even when frozen solid, these fats could be sliced thin with knives and eaten with bread. Their caloric density made them invaluable in situations where carrying large volumes of food was just impossible. Cold weather military nutrition studies conducted after the Second World War would later confirm what frontline soldiers had already learned. In extreme environments, fat actually becomes one of the most efficient survival foods available. Frozen potatoes sometimes became nearly impossible to use, despite being a staple ration. Not every food survived winter conditions well. Potatoes were a staple across European armies, but once frozen they often turned soft and watery after thawing. The freezing process ruptured their internal structure. This made them difficult to cook and, honestly, reduced their nutritional value. Field kitchens sometimes attempted to salvage frozen potatoes by boiling them into thick soups, but in many cases, large quantities had to be discarded. This problem became particularly severe for German forces during the winter of 1941-42, when poorly insulated supply depots allowed entire shipments of potatoes to freeze. The experience forced logistical planners to reconsider how staple foods were stored and transported in winter conditions. Later cold weather rations would increasingly favor dried or preserved foods rather than fresh vegetables that could freeze unpredictably. Frozen canned rations created a paradox. Food was present, but, it was just impossible to access. Canned food was supposed to solve the preservation problem, but in deep winter, it ended up creating a different one altogether. When canned rations froze solid, they became extremely difficult to open and, honestly, even harder to heat. Soldiers sometimes placed cans inside their clothing so they could thaw them slowly. Others would use engine heat from vehicles or field stoves when those were available. But in isolated positions where fuel was scarce, frozen cans could remain unusable for hours on end. Some troops even resorted to opening cans with bayonets and scraping out the frozen contents piece by piece. The lesson was pretty clear. Preservation alone did not guarantee accessibility. Modern military ration design now takes into account how easily food can be consumed under extreme environmental conditions. A lesson, really, that was partly learned from these wartime experiences. Frozen soup blocks became an improvised but surprisingly effective winter solution. One of the more creative adaptations actually emerged from the field kitchens themselves. When soups were prepared in large batches, the leftovers sometimes froze overnight into solid blocks. Rather than just discarding them, cooks discovered these frozen soup slabs could be cut into pieces and reheated later with a bit of extra water. This, in effect, created an early form of concentrated ration, dense with fat, vegetables, and meat. Although never officially standardized, frozen soup blocks became a practical way to stretch limited food supplies during those prolonged cold weather operations. The idea, honestly, resembled something closer to modern freeze-dried rations, though created entirely through environmental conditions rather than any industrial process. Scene 12, Conclusion and Call to Action. These frozen foods reveal that survival in war often depends on details that are rarely discussed. When studying the Second World War, attention naturally focuses on strategy, weapons, and major battles, but survival on the battlefield often depended on much smaller factors, like whether a soldier could actually eat the food in his pack. The forgotten frozen foods of winter warfare show how armies were forced to adapt to conditions that standard logistics had not fully anticipated. They also reveal something about human endurance. Soldiers did not survive harsh winters simply because supplies arrived. They survived because they learned how to use whatever food could endure the cold, right alongside them. Those lessons still influence modern cold-weather military planning, survival training, and expedition logistics even today. Understanding these overlooked details helps us see war more clearly, not just as a contest of armies but as a struggle against environment, endurance, and the limits of preparation. If you value deep historical analysis and the overlooked logistics that shape survival in war, consider subscribing to Logistics of Survival, and please share this video with others who appreciate the hidden details.